Columbia Business School. The invitation arrived 3 weeks ago on Columbia Business School letterhead requesting my participation in their Future Leaders in Finance speaker series. Some administrative coordinator with a hyphenated last name and pronouns in her email signature explaining how my unique perspective on cryptocurrency derivatives and alternative investment strategies would provide valuable insights for their graduate students pursuing careers in quantitative finance. The speaking fee is $25,000 for a 90-minute presentation followed by a question-and-answer session. Not bad money for telling a bunch of overeducated children why their professors have been lying to them about how markets actually work. Plus, it gives me access to potential recruits who might have the intellectual capacity and moral flexibility required for the kind of trading strategies that generate real wealth rather than academic theory. I spend Tuesday morning reviewing the student roster and faculty biographies while sitting in my office at Morgan Stanley. The diversity statistics are exactly what you'd expect from a contemporary Ivy League institution. 47% female enrollment. 38% students of color, which is corporate speak for anyone who isn't white or Asian. International students from countries where their families paid bribes to get them admitted to American universities they're not qualified to attend. The faculty directory reads like a United Nations conference roster. Professors with names like Patel and Rodriguez and Kim lecturing American students about finance principles they learned from textbooks written by dead white men are not allowed to acknowledge. Half of them have never worked in actual financial markets or made real investment decisions with other people's money. They've spent their entire careers in academic environments where theoretical models matter more than practical results. My driver arrives at exactly 1:30 p.m. in the Tesla Model S because the Cybertruck would be too conspicuous on a university campus where students protest capitalism while accumulating massive debt to purchase degrees that qualify them for entry-level positions at the same corporations they claim to oppose. The irony is lost on them because cognitive dissonance is just another academic concept they memorize for exams without understanding its practical applications. Columbia's campus looks exactly like what central casting would order for elite American university. Gothic architecture designed to suggest intellectual tradition and academic seriousness. Manicured lawns maintained by undocumented immigrants who earn less in a year than students pay for a single semester. Rich kids walking around in deliberately distressed clothing that costs more than working-class families spend on rent. I park in the faculty lot using the guest pass they provided and immediately notice the bumper stickers on other vehicles. Coexist, symbols and political slogans about social justice and environmental consciousness. These people drive luxury cars while lecturing their students about economic inequality and systemic oppression. They live in million-dollar homes while teaching courses about wealth redistribution and progressive taxation. The business school building is one of those modern glass and steel monuments to contemporary academic architecture. Everything designed to look cutting-edge and innovative while housing the same recycled ideas that have been taught in business schools for decades. Students sitting in common areas with MacBook Pros discussing their summer internships at consulting firms and investment banks that will teach them to package financial fraud as strategic advisory services. I check in with the reception desk where some graduate student assistant with purple hair and multiple facial piercings directs me to the faculty lounge. She's probably studying nonprofit management or social entrepreneurship while accumulating $200,000 in student loan debt that will take her 30 years to repay, assuming she ever finds employment that utilizes her graduate education in progressive activism disguised as business strategy. The faculty lounge looks like a hotel lobby designed by someone who thinks expensive furniture automatically creates intellectual atmosphere. Leather chairs that probably cost more than most families spend on cars. Abstract artwork on the walls that communicates sophistication to people who mistake incomprehensibility for profundity. Coffee service that costs more per day than minimum wage workers earn. Professor Janet Morrison approaches me with the kind of enthusiastic professional smile that academics use when meeting people who actually work in the industries they teach about. She's the coordinator for today's speaker series and probably makes less money in a year than I make in a month despite having spent her entire adult life studying financial markets from the safety of tenure-protected academic positions. "Mr. Vale, thank you so much for joining us today," she says, extending her hand for a brief handshake. Our students are very excited to hear from someone with your experience in the cryptocurrency space. Her experience consists of reading academic papers about cryptocurrency written by other professors who have never owned Bitcoin or executed actual trades on digital asset exchanges. She probably thinks blockchain technology is just a database management system rather than a fundamental transformation of how value transfer and storage will operate in post-national economic environments. I'm looking forward to it, I tell her, because maintaining professional courtesy is necessary for accessing the kind of recruiting opportunities that these speaking engagements provide. She leads me down a hallway lined with portraits of former deans and distinguished faculty members. Dead white men who built the intellectual foundations of modern finance theory before their institutions were captured by progressive ideologues who teach students that profit maximization is morally equivalent to theft and that successful businesspeople are inherently exploitative. We have about 40 students registered for today's session, Morrison explains as we walk toward the lecture hall. Mostly second-year MBA candidates focusing on finance and investment management. A few PhD students working on dissertations related to alternative asset classes. 40 students who will graduate with enormous debt loads and entry-level positions at firms where they'll spend their first 5 years executing trades designed by people like me who understand that academic theories about market efficiency and rational actors have no relationship to how money actually moves in contemporary financial systems. The lecture hall is one of those amphitheater-style classrooms designed to make professors feel important while they deliver information that students could acquire more efficiently by reading the same textbooks on their own. Tiered seating that creates artificial hierarchies between educators and students. Audiovisual equipment that costs more than most people's annual salaries to support PowerPoint presentations that could be delivered equally effectively through email. Students are already arriving and taking seats in clusters that probably reflect their social and professional networks. The international students sitting together because they share similar cultural backgrounds and language barriers. The women clustering together because they've been taught that business school is a hostile environment where they need mutual support to succeed against systemic gender discrimination. I recognize the type immediately. These are the children of upper-middle-class professionals who were told throughout their educational careers that they were special and deserving of success simply by virtue of working hard and following institutional rules. They've never experienced real failure or genuine adversity. They think their degrees entitle them to high-paying careers and social recognition without understanding that success requires capabilities that can't be taught in classroom environments. Before we begin, Morrison announces to the assembled students, I want to remind everyone that today's presentation is part of our ongoing commitment to exposing students to diverse perspectives from industry leaders who represent the full spectrum of approaches to contemporary finance. They invited me because I work in cryptocurrency, which they consider cutting-edge and innovative. What they don't understand is that I work in cryptocurrency because it provides opportunities for market manipulation and regulatory arbitrage that traditional asset classes don't offer. I'm not here to share diverse perspectives. I'm here to identify potential accomplices for future criminal enterprises. Today we're honored to have Preston Vale, Senior Director of Crypto Derivatives at Morgan Stanley, she continues. Mr. Vale has been instrumental in developing institutional trading strategies for digital assets and has extensive experience in quantitative finance and alternative investment structures. Instrumental in developing trading strategies. That's one way to describe systematic market manipulation and insider trading disguised as institutional research and analysis. But academic environments prefer euphemistic language that avoids acknowledging the criminal activities that generate the profits they study in their theoretical models. I step up to the podium and look out at 40 faces representing the future of American finance. Half of them are probably taking notes on iPads while simultaneously checking social media and texting their friends about whatever social justice cause they're supporting this week. The other half are calculating how much money they'll need to make to pay off their student loans while maintaining the lifestyle standards they consider appropriate for people with graduate degrees from prestigious universities. Thank you for having me, I begin, using the kind of generic opening that speakers use when addressing audiences they don't respect. I'm excited to share some insights about how digital assets are transforming traditional approaches to portfolio management and risk assessment. This is complete bullshit, of course. Digital assets aren't transforming anything. They're just creating new opportunities for the same kinds of speculation and manipulation that have always existed in financial markets. The only difference is that cryptocurrency markets have less regulatory oversight and more naive participants who can be exploited by people with traditional finance backgrounds. Before we dive into technical details about trading strategies and market dynamics, I want to talk about something more fundamental, which is the difference between what you're learning in business school and what you'll actually encounter when you start working in financial markets. Several students look up from their devices with expressions of mild interest. They probably think I'm going to deliver some kind of inspirational message about following their dreams and believing in themselves. They don't realize I'm about to explain why everything their professors have taught them about ethics and fiduciary responsibility is naive idealism that will handicap them in competitive professional environments. Your professors have probably taught you about efficient market hypothesis and rational actor theory, I say, gesturing toward Morrison, who's sitting in the back row taking notes like she's planning to incorporate my comments into her future curriculum. They've explained how markets aggregate information efficiently and how prices reflect the collective wisdom of informed participants making rational decisions based on available data. A few students nod along because they recognize these concepts from their coursework. They think understanding academic theories about market behavior somehow prepares them for actual trading environments where profits depend on exploiting the gaps between theoretical models and practical reality. This is all complete horseshit, I continue, and I can see Morrison's expression change as she realizes that my presentation isn't going to follow the inspirational template she was expecting. Markets aren't efficient. Actors aren't rational. Prices don't reflect available information. They reflect the psychological biases and emotional weaknesses of participants who make predictably irrational decisions based on fear and greed and social pressure. Now I have their attention. Students sitting up straighter and putting away their phones because I'm saying things their professors would never admit in classroom settings. I'm giving them information that could actually be useful rather than academic theory that serves no practical purpose beyond justifying faculty employment. The most successful traders aren't the ones who understand economic theory, I explain. They're the ones who understand human psychology well enough to predict and manipulate mass behavior. They're the ones who recognize that every market movement represents a transfer of wealth from people who make emotional decisions to people who make calculated decisions. This is the fundamental truth about financial markets that business schools can't acknowledge because it would undermine their entire pedagogical framework. They need to pretend that success comes from studying academic theory and following ethical guidelines rather than from understanding psychological manipulation and regulatory arbitrage. So when you start your careers, I continue, forget everything you've learned about stakeholder theory and corporate social responsibility. Those concepts exist to make employees feel good about working for organizations that extract wealth from less sophisticated participants. Focus on understanding how money actually moves and who makes the decisions that determine where it goes. I can see Morrison shifting uncomfortably in her seat because I'm contradicting the core assumptions that justify her professional existence. She spent her career teaching students that business can be both profitable and socially responsible when the reality is that profit maximization requires exploiting information asymmetries and regulatory gaps that disadvantage other market participants. Let me give you a concrete example, I say, pulling up a slide that shows Bitcoin price movements over the past 12 months. How many of you think cryptocurrency markets are driven by technological innovation and adoption metrics? About half the students raise their hands because they've been taught that asset prices reflect fundamental value drivers like utility and scarcity and network effects. They think Bitcoin goes up in price because more people are using it as a store of value or medium of exchange. Wrong, I tell them. Cryptocurrency prices are driven by market manipulation executed by people with enough capital to move prices in predictable directions. Every major price movement corresponds to coordinated buying or selling by institutional players who use their resources to create artificial scarcity or abundance. This is information they'll never hear in their regular coursework because admitting that markets are manipulated would undermine the entire theoretical foundation of modern finance education. But it's also information they need to understand if they want to succeed in environments where academic theory has no practical relevance. The same dynamics apply to every asset class, I continue. Stock prices, bond yields, commodity futures, foreign exchange rates. They're all influenced by people who have access to information and resources that allow them to profit from predictable market reactions to artificial stimuli. A student in the front row raises her hand. Asian girl with expensive-looking clothing and perfectly styled hair. Probably from a wealthy family that expects her to maintain their social status through professional achievement and marriage to someone with similar educational credentials and earning potential. Are you saying that successful investing requires engaging in market manipulation? She asks, apparently trying to reconcile my practical advice with whatever ethical framework she learned in her corporate responsibility coursework. I'm saying that successful investing requires understanding how markets actually work rather than how professors think they should work, I reply. If you limit yourself to strategies that comply with your moral preferences, you'll be systematically disadvantaged relative to participants who optimize purely for results. This is the choice that every finance professional faces but that business schools refuse to acknowledge explicitly. You can either maintain your ethical principles and accept mediocre performance, or you can abandon naive moral constraints and compete effectively against people who understand that markets reward superior information and strategic positioning rather than moral virtue. But doesn't that create systemic risks when everyone adopts purely self-interested strategies? Asks another student, apparently concerned about the broader social implications of amoral profit maximization. Systemic risks are someone else's problem, I tell him. Your job is to generate returns for your clients and employers, not to manage macroeconomic stability or social welfare outcomes. Those are policy responsibilities that belong to regulators and politicians, not investment professionals. This represents the fundamental division of labor in contemporary capitalism. Investment professionals optimize for financial returns within whatever regulatory constraints exist, while government officials manage systemic risks and social outcomes through policy interventions. Expecting individual traders to sacrifice profits for broader social benefits creates coordination problems that reduce overall economic efficiency. Plus, the regulatory system is designed to prevent truly dangerous systemic risks while allowing profitable exploitation of information asymmetries and behavioral biases, I add. So you can pursue optimal strategies without worrying about causing actual economic collapse or social instability. Several students look skeptical about this reassurance, probably because they've been taught that unfettered capitalism inevitably leads to inequality and environmental destruction. They don't understand that regulatory systems evolve to prevent the most catastrophic outcomes while preserving the incentive structures that drive innovation and wealth creation. Let me ask you a question, I say, deciding to directly challenge their progressive assumptions about business ethics. How many of you chose to attend Columbia Business School because you want to make the world a better place? About 30 hands go up, which is exactly what I expected. These students have been conditioned to justify their pursuit of high-paying careers through appeals to social responsibility and positive impact. They can't admit that they're primarily motivated by personal financial gain and social status advancement. And how many of you expect to earn more than $200,000 per year after graduation? I continue. The same 30 hands remain raised, apparently without recognizing the contradiction between their stated altruistic motivations and their actual financial expectations. So you want to make the world better by joining the same industries and institutions that you claim are responsible for inequality and environmental problems, I point out. You're going to work for investment banks and consulting firms and hedge funds while telling yourselves that you're somehow different from previous generations who made similar choices. Now they're starting to look uncomfortable because I'm forcing them to confront the cognitive dissonance between their political beliefs and their career aspirations. They want to maintain their progressive self-image while pursuing the same wealth accumulation strategies that define successful participation in capitalist systems. The reality is that you're here because you want money and status, I continue. There's nothing wrong with that. But pretending that your personal ambitions serve broader social purposes is intellectually dishonest and strategically counterproductive. A few students shift in their seats and I can see Morrison taking more detailed notes, probably planning to file some kind of complaint about my deviation from appropriate academic discourse. But the students are engaged in ways they probably never are during regular coursework because I'm discussing topics that actually matter for their future careers. Here's what I recommend, I say, moving toward more practical advice now that I've established the intellectual framework. Stop worrying about whether your career choices align with your political beliefs. Focus on developing skills that generate results in competitive environments. Learn to recognize opportunities that other people miss. Understand how regulatory systems create arbitrage possibilities. Build networks with people who have access to useful information. This is the kind of career guidance that business schools should provide but can't because it would contradict their official mission statements about developing ethical leaders and socially responsible business practices. Students need practical advice about succeeding in systems that reward competence rather than virtue. Most importantly, I continue, learn to separate your public persona from your private strategies. You can advocate for progressive policies and social justice causes while privately optimizing for personal financial gain. The key is maintaining consistent messaging that appeals to whatever audiences matter for your career advancement. Several students are writing notes now, apparently recognizing that I'm sharing information they won't get from their regular professors. They're learning how successful professionals navigate the gap between public expectations and private incentives without sacrificing their competitive positioning. Any questions about practical applications? I ask, genuinely curious about whether these students have enough real-world understanding to ask intelligent questions about implementation details. A male student in expensive clothing raises his hand. Probably from old money based on his posture and facial structure. The kind of genetic and social advantages that make success almost inevitable regardless of individual competence or moral character. What about ESG investing and stakeholder capitalism, he asks. Are those genuine trends or just marketing strategies? Marketing strategies, I reply immediately. ESG metrics are designed to make institutional investors feel better about pursuing profit maximization while maintaining plausible deniability about the social and environmental costs of their investment decisions. Environmental, social, and governance investing represents the perfect synthesis of progressive virtue signaling and traditional capitalism. Investors can claim to support sustainable development and social justice while generating returns through the same extractive processes that created the problems they claim to be solving. Companies spend enormous amounts of money on ESG compliance and reporting because it's cheaper than actually changing their business models, I explain. It's a form of regulatory capture where corporations shape the metrics used to evaluate their performance rather than being held accountable to external standards. This is why ESG investing has become so popular among institutional investors who want to attract capital from pension funds and endowments with progressive investment mandates. It provides the appearance of ethical investing without requiring sacrifice of financial returns or fundamental changes to investment strategies. Plus, ESG funds consistently underperform traditional indexes because they're limited to companies that meet arbitrary social responsibility criteria rather than companies that generate optimal risk-adjusted returns, I add. So investors pay higher fees for worse performance while telling themselves they're making positive social impact. A female student raises her hand with an expression of obvious disagreement. She's probably majoring in sustainable business or social entrepreneurship and expects me to validate her career choice rather than explaining why it's economically irrational. But doesn't someone need to consider long-term sustainability and social outcomes when making investment decisions? She asks. If everyone just focuses on short-term profits, won't that create problems for future generations? Future generations will solve their own problems using technologies and resources that don't exist yet, I tell her. Your job is to optimize outcomes within your own time horizon, not to sacrifice current opportunities for hypothetical future benefits that may never materialize. This represents one of the fundamental errors in contemporary progressive thinking about economics and investment strategy. The assumption that current generations have moral obligations to future generations that should override present optimization opportunities. But future technological development and resource discovery consistently exceed pessimistic projections about scarcity and environmental limits. Plus, markets already incorporate long-term sustainability considerations through pricing mechanisms, I continue. Companies that pursue unsustainable business models face higher capital costs and reduced valuations. You don't need additional ESG constraints to ensure that investment decisions reflect long-term viability. What about climate change? She persists, apparently determined to defend her ideological commitments despite economic evidence that contradicts her assumptions. Climate change represents investment opportunities for people smart enough to position themselves correctly, I reply. Alternative energy, carbon trading, green technology development. There's enormous money to be made from regulatory changes and consumer preferences related to environmental concerns. This is the practical reality that environmental activists refuse to acknowledge. Climate change creates massive wealth transfer opportunities for investors who understand how government policies and consumer behavior will change in response to environmental concerns. Rather than viewing environmental problems as moral obligations, successful investors treat them as profit opportunities. The key is identifying which environmental trends will actually affect business models and which ones are just political theater, I explain. Most ESG investing is based on virtue signaling rather than rigorous analysis of how environmental changes will impact specific industries and companies. Another student raises his hand, apparently emboldened by the increasingly frank nature of our discussion about topics that professors usually avoid in classroom settings. What's your opinion about diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives in financial services? He asks, probably expecting me to provide some kind of balanced perspective that acknowledges both benefits and challenges of contemporary DEI policies. They're counterproductive from a business perspective and harmful to the people they're supposed to help, I say directly, causing Morrison to stop taking notes and look up with obvious concern about the direction of our conversation. Diversity initiatives force companies to prioritize demographic characteristics over competency metrics, which reduces overall organizational performance and creates resentment among high-performing employees who see less qualified colleagues getting promoted based on identity categories rather than results. This is the reality that everyone in professional environments understands but can't discuss publicly without risking career destruction and social ostracism. DEI policies create workplace dysfunction and reduced productivity while failing to address the underlying factors that cause demographic disparities in professional outcomes. Plus, they stigmatize high-performing employees from preferred demographic groups by creating the assumption that their success results from preferential treatment rather than individual competence, I continue. This undermines exactly the people these policies are designed to help. I can see Morrison making some kind of signal toward the door, probably preparing to end the session early because my responses are deviating too far from acceptable academic discourse. But the students are more engaged than they've been during the entire presentation because I'm discussing topics that actually affect their future career prospects. The financial services industry has the most objective performance metrics of any professional field, I explain. Revenue generation, risk management, portfolio optimization. There's no ambiguity about results. Either you create value or you don't. Either you generate profits or you don't. Demographic characteristics have no relationship to these outcomes. But what about the research showing that diverse teams make better decisions? Asks the same female student who was defending ESG investing, apparently unwilling to abandon her progressive assumptions despite contrary evidence. That research is methodologically flawed and politically motivated, I reply. It defines diversity in terms of demographic characteristics rather than cognitive diversity or relevant skill sets. And it measures decision quality using subjective criteria that can be manipulated to support predetermined conclusions. The actual research on team performance shows that cognitive diversity and complementary skill sets improve decision-making quality, but these factors don't correlate with demographic diversity in professional environments that select for similar educational backgrounds and intellectual capabilities. Plus, diversity initiatives in financial services consistently select for people with identical ideological perspectives and similar socioeconomic backgrounds, I continue. The only diversity is superficial demographic characteristics. The cognitive homogeneity is actually worse than traditional hiring practices. This represents one of the fundamental contradictions in contemporary diversity policies. They create demographic diversity while reducing intellectual diversity because they select for people who share progressive political beliefs and upper-middle-class cultural values regardless of their ethnic or gender identity. Mr. Vale, Morrison interrupts from the back of the room, I think we should probably move toward wrapping up our session. I know you have other commitments this afternoon. She's obviously uncomfortable with the direction of our discussion and wants to end the presentation before I say anything that could generate complaints from students or faculty members who disagree with my perspectives on contemporary business practices and social policies. Of course, I reply, because maintaining professional courtesy is necessary even when dealing with people whose entire worldview is based on ideological delusions rather than empirical evidence. Let me leave you with some final thoughts about succeeding in competitive professional environments. The students lean forward slightly, apparently hoping for practical advice that will give them advantages over their peers who are receiving conventional academic guidance about career development and professional advancement. First, understand that success requires capabilities that can't be taught in classroom environments, I begin. Risk tolerance, strategic thinking, psychological manipulation, information acquisition. These are skills you develop through experience, not through studying theoretical frameworks. Second, learn to separate public messaging from private strategy. You can advocate for whatever political causes are popular in your social environment while privately pursuing strategies that optimize for personal advancement and financial gain. Third, build relationships with people who have access to useful information and decision-making authority. Network effects matter more than individual competence in most professional contexts. Knowing the right people is more valuable than knowing the right information. Finally, ignore advice from people who haven't achieved the outcomes you want to achieve. Most professors have never worked in the industries they teach about. Most diversity consultants have never managed profit and loss responsibility. Most ESG advocates have never generated significant investment returns. Focus on learning from people who have successfully navigated the environments you want to enter. Copy their strategies rather than their public statements. Observe their behavior rather than listening to their speeches. Several students are writing notes furiously, apparently recognizing that I'm providing practical career guidance that contradicts everything they've learned in their regular coursework but aligns with observable patterns of professional success in competitive industries. Thank you for your time and attention, I conclude. I hope some of these insights prove useful as you transition from academic environments to professional careers. The students applaud politely while Morrison approaches the podium with obvious relief that the presentation is finally over. She probably needs to do damage control with students who might complain about my politically incorrect perspectives on diversity policies and social responsibility initiatives. Thank you so much for sharing your insights, she says with forced enthusiasm. I'm sure our students have gained valuable perspectives on contemporary challenges in financial services. Contemporary challenges. Right. The contemporary challenge is maintaining competitive advantage in environments where institutional policies prioritize ideological conformity over practical results. But academic institutions can't acknowledge this because it would undermine their entire educational framework. Students are gathering their belongings and filing out of the lecture hall with expressions of obvious intellectual stimulation. They've probably never heard anyone directly challenge the progressive assumptions that dominate contemporary higher education. They're realizing that successful professionals often hold very different views from what they encounter in classroom environments. A few students approach the podium with follow-up questions, apparently hoping for additional practical guidance about career development and professional advancement strategies. Do you have any specific advice about getting hired at top-tier investment banks? Asks the male student who questioned me about ESG investing earlier. Demonstrate quantitative capabilities and psychological resilience, I tell him. Most candidates have similar educational credentials and technical skills. What matters is your ability to handle stress and make decisions under pressure while maintaining professional relationships that generate business opportunities. What about work-life balance? Asks another student, apparently concerned about the personal costs of pursuing high-paying careers in demanding professional environments. Work-life balance is for people who don't have compelling professional opportunities, I reply. If you're genuinely passionate about what you're doing and compensated appropriately for your contributions, work becomes the most interesting part of your life rather than something you need to balance against other activities. This is the reality that career counselors and academic advisors refuse to acknowledge. The most successful professionals are obsessed with their work to degrees that would be considered unhealthy by people who view careers as necessary burdens rather than opportunities for personal fulfillment and financial advancement. After answering several more questions about practical career strategies and industry dynamics, I excuse myself and head toward the exit. Morrison escorts me back to the faculty lounge where we exchange business cards and discuss potential future speaking opportunities. Your presentation certainly generated a lot of discussion, she says diplomatically, apparently trying to determine whether my perspectives represent mainstream industry views or personal opinions that deviate from professional norms. Students benefit from exposure to different viewpoints, I reply, using the same euphemistic language that academics employ when discussing controversial topics. It's important for them to understand the full range of approaches to contemporary business challenges. She nods uncertainly, probably planning to review her notes and determine whether any of my comments crossed lines that would require formal complaints or policy violations. Academic institutions have elaborate procedures for managing speakers who express views that conflict with official diversity and inclusion commitments. Walking back to my car, I think about the 40 students who heard my presentation today. Most of them will graduate and accept entry-level positions at firms where they'll spend their careers implementing strategies designed by people like me who understand how markets actually work rather than how professors think they should work. A few of them might have the intellectual capacity and moral flexibility required for more advanced applications of the principles I discussed. Those are the ones worth recruiting for future business opportunities that require sophisticated understanding of regulatory arbitrage and information asymmetries. The really intelligent students will recognize that everything I told them contradicts their formal education but aligns with observable patterns of professional success in competitive environments. They'll start developing private strategies that optimize for results rather than ideological consistency. And eventually some of them will become my competitors or collaborators in markets where academic theory has no practical relevance and success depends on understanding human psychology well enough to predict and manipulate mass behavior. But most of them will continue believing that their degrees entitle them to high-paying careers and social recognition without understanding that success requires capabilities that can't be taught in classroom environments. They'll spend their careers confused about why their academic preparation didn't translate into professional advancement despite following all the conventional advice about networking and skill development. The cognitive dissonance between their educational conditioning and professional reality will create psychological stress that manifests as cynicism about capitalism and nostalgia for academic environments where theoretical knowledge was more valuable than practical results. They'll become the middle managers and policy analysts who implement decisions made by people like me who understand that markets reward superior information and strategic positioning rather than moral virtue or theoretical sophistication. Which is exactly how the system is supposed to work.